From wiping out entire crops thanks to changes in flooding patterns to El Niño's devastating effects on food security, here's how floods have affected farm production in 2023. The climate catastrophes upon us. No matter what those folks on Twitter say, global warming's switched gears now, and it's coming at the human race fast. Because of rising temperatures, the whole weather cycle suffered a huge shift, and now the increase in flooding has wreaked chaos all over. As warmer temperatures cause more water to evaporate from the land and the oceans, this affects the whole process that causes rain. And because of that, there's a huge chance in the size and frequency of heavy precipitation, which then affects the size and frequency of the water bodies flooding. Melting glaciers and unusual timing of snowmelt can also affect flood patterns, leading to devastating effects. Not only has it ruined stuff like infrastructure and drowned villages in third world countries, but it's wiped away entire crops. And this had led to a significant amount of food insecurity. Just take a look at what's happened in Vermont. Farms across the state are now looking at millions of dollars in destruction, and that's all because of the aftermath of the mass flooding in July 2023. While some were lucky enough because the heavy rainfall didn't affect them much, others just weren't that fortunate. The development director at the Intervale Center in Burlington, Merlene Guild, said that this was the worst timing in the growing season for the floods to happen, and farmers all around the state agree. Vermont saw as much as 9 inches of rain because of a powerful storm system that moved north into New England, causing severe flooding. Rivers Winsookie that runs through Montpelier and the Lamoille both surpassed the levels they'd once reached during Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, making this the state's worst climactic disaster yet. Not only did this cause the death of a 63-year-old man who drowned at his house in Barr, but the residents of the state capital as well as small mountain towns faced the worst destruction the state has ever seen. The situation in Vermont's pretty bad all over, but the farmers have suffered the most amount of damage. Folks are now scrambling to recoup losses. Just as the peak of the harvest season was about to begin, one of the co-owners of Digger's Mirth Collective Farm, Dylan Ziedel, was heartbroken over the loss of his thriving row of cilantro plants, which were now flattened and caked with silt after the floods. He said that his whole setup had gone from a well-oiled machine to so much uncertainty that he's not sure what the future holds for him. Dylan estimated that his farm would have raked in over $350,000 this season. But now, even if he's able to clear out the mud and plant a small batch of his crops again in time for a relatively smaller harvest, the off chance of him making only a third of that seems far-fetched, too. According to the initial numbers, approximately 7 farmers have been affected by the floods, which is a number way worse than Irene. Pitchfork Farms' Eric Seitz was also crushed after the loss of a whole year's worth of hard work. The Vermont farmer's 30-acre vegetable farm in Burlington, which once grew and locally delivered organic produce like radishes, green onions, and salad greens, has now lost an estimated $350,000 to $400,000 in crop sales after the terrible storm that shook the entire state. For Eric, the damage is a whole lot worse because there's not a single produce on his land that's worth salvaging now. And everything's covered in debris. Before the storm, a warning was sent out to prepare for the incoming rainfall, and even though a bunch of volunteers came around to help pick, some of the radishes and scallion, since Pitchfork's right at the tail end of the river, by the time the floods had taken over, the field had just become a part of the river. While Vermont's farming loss has left a significant impact on the food security of the state, the farmers are now documenting their losses to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Service Agency, so that they can recover from the losses and replant crops as soon as possible. The increase in flooding hasn't only affected first world countries like the United States. India's had a prevalent history of floods that affect millions every year. In 2022, the farmers in Uttar Pradesh, India, were hit by a double whammy. After their farms were hit by continuous rain in October, just as they were recovering from the effects of one of the harshest droughts in the country's history, The rains ruined crops like rice paddies, sugarcane, mustard, potatoes, as well as other vegetables in large parts of the state. And farmers are not too confident about being able to grow new crops either. Thanks to rising inflation and unpredictable weather patterns, the floods have ruined the quality of the standing paddy crops, deeming them unsuitable for harvesting. And because of the untimely rains, this had delayed the sowing of wheat crops too. Wheat's one of the food staples of the country, so a decrease in production will not only lead to increased costs, but it'll further affect the food insecurity in the region. In 2023, India is currently facing a huge shortage of tomatoes, and the per kilogram cost has increased by a whopping 400%, which is more than the price of a liter of petrol in the country. In fact, the entire situation's got so bad that even McDonald's India just announced that they're no longer serving tomatoes either. I mean, if an international food chain's gotta make an announcement like that, then that tells you a lot about the state of the country and the effect the floods have had on farm production. Farmers are out there losing key staples and their livelihoods, plunging them deeper and deeper into poverty. And that's no way to live. Thankfully, modern-day agricultural technologies improved to the point that it's now working toward mitigating effects by producing flood-resistant rice that can help farmers grow crops, keeping the changing weather patterns in mind. Here's a little Science 101 for you. So rice is a crop that absolutely thrives in water. But because of the untimely monsoon rainfall and floods, it's hard to plant these crops, which then threatens the winter harvest. Now, to curb the losses and make sure countries like the African nations don't suffer from rice shortages either, considering it's one of their biggest important, a flood-resistant variety of rice has been introduced to minimize losses during flood season. The new seed technology has a clear advantage over traditional ones in flood-stricken areas, and the future of farming looks promising if agritech finds ways to produce more seeds that can resist the effects of climate change. But not so fast, because even if researchers somehow present viable solutions, there's nothing that can stop El Niño's unpredictability from reaching its full potential. And what's that, you ask? Well, El Niño's an unusual warming of the surface of water bodies, such as the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. In modern technology, it's the warm phase of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which has a cool phase that goes by the name El Niña, which is the usual cooling of the region's surface waters. With me so far? Good. Now, El Niño affects the ocean's temperatures and the speed and strength of ocean currents, as well as the health of the fisheries by the coast. Not just that, but it also affects the local weather from Australia to South America and beyond. This is an important concept because of how El Niño can affect climate. Any climate anomaly associated with the teleconnections or the weather's own Bluetooth system is now called an El Niño event. And you guys, this El Niño event then leads to changes in air pressure, wind speed, causing all kinds of chaos to the weather cycle, which then leads to natural disasters. Because the climate phenomenon enables the warming of water surfaces that increases the chances of rainfall and ends up causing floods. But here's where things get even more interesting. When it rains in South America, because of El Niño, it brings droughts over to Indonesia and Australia. Droughts, as we know, are super bad for agriculture because they threaten a region's water supply, making irrigation an incredibly difficult process for the farmers. Both effects of El Niño on farming lie at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And since we need optimum conditions for maximum crop yield, this endangers the amount of food available, increasing the chances of food insecurity. The El Niño event in 1997 was one of the most powerful ones in history, leading up to $5.7 trillion worth of income losses all around the world. Back then, the predicted damage was only $96 billion. So you can imagine the effect it's gonna have this time around. An estimate of $84 trillion worth of economic losses by the end of the century was made by researchers. So unless the authorities across the globe take measures to dampen these effects, the future of farming and eventually the world seems dark. And there you have it, from El Niño's devastating effects on food security to wiping out entire crops thanks to changes in flooding patterns. This was how floods have affected farm production in 2023.